So I'm just trying to navigating all of the things out the way. And right, hopefully you can see my slides now, so I'll kick off. So good afternoon, thanks everyone for joining today's session. So I'm going to give an overview of business continuity and some of the things to consider around this particular topic. So first of all, let me do an introduction. And it starts with who am I? So first of all, I'm Chris Killier. I am the interim HSCQ director for the UK and Ireland at Sodexo, and I've worked in this space for around 13 years. I started as a junior QA manager for an FM organisation, and I worked all the way through from the last 13 years up to the role that I'm currently doing now. I'm also a chartered fellow of the Chartered Quality Institute, and I've spent most of my career in facilities management, so 15 plus years. And in some of the organizations I've worked for, you can see there, so Arcus FM was there for about 10 years, worked for JLL Integral for about 3 years, and I've been with Sodexo now for the last 3 years. But in addition to that, I'm also, and I think this is quite important to note, I'm also a husband, a father, a musician, a gardener, a Trekkie, and a Lord of the Rings and a Disney fan. A bit about my mission. So my most important goal is the humanizing of the HSEQ professional. My view is that there's a person and a collection of stories, experience, and passion behind HSEQ professionals, behind every HSEQ professional, in fact. And I'm pushing to show that the value of being the conscience of the business or the organization, in fact, goes beyond just the tangible. I also am looking to simplify and demystify what we do as HSCQ professionals, or in fact, most of the people here potentially just safety professionals. I still get asked by people in large corporates, SMEs, family and friends, what is it you actually do again? What does HSCQ mean? And isn't it just health and safety gone mad? But my view is that we need to bring meaning and tangible context to what we do. And that's a very key part of my mission as well. I very much believe that social media is an exceptionally powerful tool, and I regularly use these mediums to broadcast the impact of our profession. And I really am keen and passionate about driving our talent pipeline for the future. We ultimately need our profession to be more visible. We need it to be more visible to prospective talent, and with that, getting more people interested and excited about exploring a career in HSEQ. So that's a little bit about me. Key part of bringing in a bit about my mission and a bit about me as a human as well is, in fact, it just endorses that that's a really key part of my mission, to humanize each HSEQ professional. So moving on to what you're here for, which is business continuity. So first of all, I think the important thing is to define what business continuity actually is. The ISO 22301 definition, which is the business continuity standard, states that business continuity is the capability of an organization to continue the delivery of products and services within acceptable timeframes at predefined capacity during a disruption. So what does that actually mean? Essentially, it means that when an incident occurs that breaches our risk controls, that a response to continue critical operations is invoked. And the key thing to note here is critical operations. If we enter a crisis scenario, we need to focus on the critical operations. Anything that isn't essential to the main products and services, isn't essential to life safety or brand, those types of things can wait. So it's about us being able to identify that an incident has breached our risk controls, and then we are able to respond to that and the critical services within that adequately and effectively. Now, some examples of the types of incidents that might occur that can disrupt business continuity, and these are also known as disruptive events. So these aren't all of the types of disruptive events. These are just a handful of some of the key ones that can emerge. So the first one in the bottom left, that is for some that might recognize, that's the blue screen of death. That is an IT failure. So that's quite familiar as of late as well, because for some that were affected by the recent CrowdStrike issue, that was the recurring thing that plagued the majority of screens for the affected users. But essentially, that type of disruptive incident is IT infrastructure. It could be a system that you're using, whether that in the FM industry, the system could be the way that you actually understand what it is that your clients are looking for. So if they log a work request, for you to be able to then arrange for an engineer to attend to a site, if that system that manages all of that is down, then you're not able to deliver your critical service. Similarly, if your main communication medium is things like email, or if you're using cloud-based applications, any of those types of infrastructure or applications that you have a reliance on to deliver your core critical operations, if they are down, it affects your ability to continue operating. So IT is one of the key ones. Next one, the one next to it, which is directly linked, is cyber. So whilst it is linked to IT infrastructure, it has aspects of it that are separate. So it could be in this instance that you have a ransomware attack. It could be a cyber attack of a different type of magnitude. It could be phishing. It could be brand theft. It can be identity theft, whatever it would look like. But essentially, if it has the potential to affect your critical operations, especially if you get locked out of a system via a ransomware attack. The next one is around supply chain. So supply chain has multiple facets to it. It could be that the supply chain aspect in this context is that you deliver your product or service via a supplier. So if that supplier is unable to deliver that service for a variety of reasons, it could be that there is an effect that your supplier's main manufacturing location is inoperable for whatever reason. It could be that they deliver a service to you and their logistics is unable to meet the demand at that point. Could be that they go into administration. Either way, if there is an effect on your supply chain and that supply chain is critical to you to be able to deliver your operations, then there is a risk there that it becomes a disruptive event. Next one is around, so this is a building showing a building on fire, but the representation there is that it could be that you have a manufacturing site where your key operations are operating out of. It could be that it's your head office where all of your key services are delivered from that head office. It could be a client site. Whatever it looks like, if there is an inability to access that location, or that location has something has happened to it, rendering it inoperable, it could be a fire, it could be a flood, it could be an access issue, whatever it is, by having the critical operations within that location unaccessible or inaccessible, that becomes a business continuity event. The next one is, as we all probably quite rightly recognize, the pandemic. So this was a very real business continuity event for pretty much all organizations across the globe, which was the COVID pandemic. Now, prior to the COVID pandemic actually emerging, it was a prominent feature in every business continuity plan that you'd list out all of the potential scenarios. Pandemic was always listed, but never actually thought that it would ever materialize as an actual event. In this instance, it did, and it was a very prominent event for a number of years. And the final one on here, but not the only, and again, just to emphasize, these aren't the only 6, these are just some of the core ones to be considering. The final one here is severe weather. So this could be snow. It could be that if your operation requires that you have that you're transporting, if you're doing deliveries, if you have mobile engineering services, whatever it would look like, if you're unable to travel, you're unable to deliver if your fleet is inoperable for whatever reason, that will affect your business continuity. It could be that the severe weather has affected a particular location. It could be that it's generated power outages, whatever it looks like. Either way, these are some examples of the types of incidents that could then result in a disruptive event. So there's an overview of business continuity, types of examples, types of incidents that could affect your business continuity. And it might seem obvious, but there are absolutely reasons for why we need this. I'll start with risk management. So risk management in the foreseeable sense. So as health and safety professionals, we understand the principles and the fundamentals of risk. In this context, it's really critical that we identify the risk that could affect our business's continuity, organization's continuity, and that there are controls deployed to prevent those risks from becoming issues. But this is all in the foreseeable sense of risk management. But there are also the unknown events. So these are the unforeseen, unpredictable, serious events that could occur that weren't necessarily foreseeable. And in some instances, and in fact, you could argue that COVID was an example of that. It was unforeseen, it was unpredictable, arguably, and it did have a serious impact on a multitude of organizations. But these are called black swans. Regardless of whether it is a foreseeable risk or an unforeseeable risk, we rely on our controls to prevent that from becoming an issue. So in the foreseeable sense, if the risk control fails, then we still need an emergency response, which is our BCP. In the unforeseeable sense, we don't necessarily have risk controls to enable it to prevent it from becoming an issue. And subsequently, we still need an emergency response. So whether it's foreseeable or unforeseeable, we still need a business continuity plan. Now, in a really high level context of why we need it, business continuity is about continuing our critical operations. I cannot emphasize that enough. The word critical operations is the key part here. We need to use it to minimize the impact to our organization, people, infrastructure, interested parties, etc. And what I mean by that is, whilst we're trying to focus on continuing our critical operations, it could be that there is an impact on that disruptive event on other aspects that we would also need to be managing in addition to our critical operations. So for example, let's say you have a head office that you have that is, or a manufacturing site that you have is where you deliver your core product. And that building has caught fire, and critical operation continuation is a key thing to be considering how we address that. But in addition, we also need to be considering the impacts to the neighborhood, the environment, to infrastructure, to other interested parties. So it can't just be dedicated to just the critical operations. We have to be considering the wider context of the impacts to that, and also minimizing what that impact might look like. Because ultimately, preserving the organization's brand integrity is a key part. If we have an instance where a manufacturing site has caught fire, the building is inoperable, the wider environment has been affected by that, we will have the media very much interested in exploring what that might mean and what that might look like. So subsequently, we need to be issuing out statements where appropriate. We need to be able to be responding to whatever interest that media interest might look like to be. Otherwise, we are running the risk that in addition to having to continue our operations, minimizing the impact, we might actually be affecting our brand integrity by not addressing that. So why we need it is to address the risk that's become an issue where we don't have a control adequate to prevent it from becoming a critical event. So some high-level things to consider when we're thinking about the business continuity framework. So we all know what management systems look like. So this is a high-level overview of the key things to be considering when you're thinking about business continuity as a framework. So I've touched on risk management already, but some of the things here, what threats could disrupt business continuity? Not every risk that you would have identified in your organization's risk matrix is going to be a threat to business continuity. So it's understanding what threats are relevant to affecting your organization's continuity, and then looking at whether we've actually got the relevant mitigations to prevent that threat from becoming an issue. Noting, of course, that risk management is key here because we don't want to go into a business continuity scenario. We want to be in an event where business continuity is the last line of defense. Risk management ultimately catches that risk before it becomes an issue. By understanding our risks and our threats, we're then able to do our business impact analysis. So if we understand what threats we've got that could disrupt our business continuity, we need to then look at analyzing a bit about those threats, but also what actually are our critical services. So I've talked about and I've emphasized the words critical operations, critical services throughout this, and I will continue to do that. In this instance, if we don't understand what our critical operations are, we can't necessarily have a plan to how we continue operating in the event of a disruptive incident. So we really need to understand what actually are our critical services. And then also understanding how long we can survive without those critical services. So what we're thinking about here is if our core operation, and I'll use the example of a facilities management provider, something that's closest to me, to bring it to context. If we have, if our core service is to deliver mobile engineering solutions, so in the event that a client has a power cut or heating failure, and they need an engineer to attend to their site to resolve that particular issue, then that's our core service. We go out and fix client issues that resolve on their premises. If that's our critical service, we need to understand how long we can survive without that critical service operating. So it could be that we have core SLAs that require us to achieve 90% of those SLAs within the time frame. And if our SLAs are 1 hour long with a 2-hour resolution time frame around it, then we need to achieve 90% of those. What happens if we don't achieve 90% of those? At what point does it become an intolerable and unacceptable risk for that core service being inoperable? So we don't just understand the risks and the threats to our business continuity, understanding whether they're mitigated. We need to understand our core critical services and how long we can survive without those core critical services. Once we've understood that, that's when we can build our business continuity plans for how we respond to the instances where those critical services have been disrupted by a threat that we've identified. How we respond to that is the key part here. We need to have a very clear plan. It has to be simple, and it has to be communicated and understood by all of the relevant parties that will be involved in mobilizing that particular plan. And I'll talk through a bit more of that in a further slide. After we've got our business continuity plans in place, we then need to test them. So we don't want to be testing them in a live event when everything has gone wrong and that we're in a crisis scenario. We want to be testing them as part of a planned regime so that we can decide and understand if they are effective and how well they will stand up in the event that a disruptive event actually occurs. Now, this is only going to ever be a simulation. The simulations are still planned, and they don't necessarily have the degree of ambiguity that or volatility that a disruptive event would have. But it still gives a good indication as to how well your plan is going to hold up in the event that a disruptive incident occurs. So we need to have an exercising and testing regime in place, and we need to have an evaluation mechanism for assessing how effective those plans are. We also need to have a post-incident review process. So in the event that there is actually a business continuity event, a disruptive event that takes place, we need to have a process in place for us to be evaluating all of the events that took place prior to, during, and after that disruptive event, so that we can put in additional mitigations to prevent that particular disruptive event happening again, or also for us to be able to address future disruptive events in a more controlled way. Sometimes PIRs give us an opportunity to see that there were foreseeable risks that we just hadn't necessarily considered, and that helps to strengthen our risk management protocols in future events. So it's not always about strengthening the business continuity response. Sometimes the PIR actually gives insight into how you can strengthen your risk management protocols. So that's a really high-level overview of the steps to take in a business continuity framework. I want to hone in now on the business impact analysis. This is often a part that, in my experience, is one of the most overlooked parts to the business continuity lifecycle. So I'll reiterate, the business continuity plans recover our critical operations, but the business impact analysis is there to identify those critical operations. So when we're thinking of critical operations, we're thinking of what is the infrastructure, the processes, and the functions that is needed to deliver your products and services. So within that, you need to be opening up a dialogue with all of the relevant stakeholders in your organization, whether it's an internal interested party, an external interested party. It could be, if we're thinking of the infrastructure, it could be IT infrastructure. It could be physical infrastructure in the sense of locations, premises, etc. It could be your supply chain infrastructure, whatever it is, but that dialogue needs to be with those stakeholders. It can't just be an insular, internal conversation with one or two stakeholders. We have to understand the broad impact and the broad dependencies that there are between processes, functions, and infrastructure, and how they affect products and services. We also need to understand who owns them, and ownership when you're in a crisis scenario is critical, because the last thing you want to be doing when you have got time critical issues emerging at very, very rapid rates with very upset and panicking stakeholders asking you who's dealing with X and no one knows who that is. So we need to understand who owns what when we're in a non-crisis scenario. And then we also need to understand what dependencies exist. Sometimes, for example, an IT application that you're dependent on to deliver a critical function is reliant on another piece of infrastructure. And understanding those dependencies is key to knowing where, if one thing is affected, then multiple other things could also be affected by that one item being affected. So understanding those dependencies is key. It's then important to understand, in fact, what that impact could look like. So how long can you survive without that critical operation? The term in the business continuity definition library is the maximum tolerable period of disruption. And that is how long before that impact becomes unacceptable or intolerable. And the way to think about that is if you're a business, it would be at the point that you lose clients, that you lose client confidence, or that you create contractual breach. It could be that at what point you have regulatory action as a result of the impact. So it's how long is the maximum you can survive without the critical operation. And when you think of the maximum tolerable period of disruption, you then work backwards from that to understand that that is what your objective for recovery is. And you also need to think about what are the impacts over time that could materialize when that critical operation is down. So we need to be thinking about, and when I said working your way backwards, if you know that 10 hours without critical operation X is the maximum that you can survive before the risk that the impact becomes unacceptable, and you're working your way back from 10 hours, what happens at 9 hours, 8 hours, 7 hours, 6 hours, etc., to understand what could materialize at each point. And it could be that it goes beyond the delivery of services and products. It could be that it has an effect on an impact on life safety, an impact on brand, an impact on the surrounding area, whatever it would look like. It's important to understand that. And just for context, where I've said hours there, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's days, weeks, months, whatever it could be. Very rarely months, in fact. Now, the outputs of the BIA provide the input to the BCP, because by knowing what your critical operations are, who owns them, what dependencies exist, and knowing what the impact of those being inoperable are, gives you the information to be able to form what your BCP looks like. Because the BIA will then tell us what is it we need to focus on recovering. If we know that our critical operation is X, we don't need to put in our BCP that we're going to recover Y. So as an example, in the FM world, I know that if we have a disruptive incident and we need to be solely focused on sending engineers to sites where there are critical disruptions to client infrastructure, then I'm not going to be particularly concerned about our commercial team not being active in that particular event. I'm not going to be particularly concerned about the ability to manage invoicing. I'm not going to be particularly concerned about HR administration, for example. Now, those are very key processes, but they're not critical to the survival of the organization. That's where the BIA tells us that these are our critical services that are needed to deliver, that need to be delivered in the crisis scenario. So our BCP will focus on those. It then tells us as well who needs to be involved in that particular recovery. So you will have, as part of your business continuity plan, you'll have a response team. We need to know who needs to be involved as part of that response team. So who's going to do what during the recovery? We also need to understand who has an interest and an input into the affected operation. So I mentioned before about understanding what the dependencies are. That's across process, infrastructure, products and services. but it also needs to be across departments and interested parties. And then we also need to look at how long we have to recover the operations. So where I said that we work backwards from the maximum tolerable period of disruption, we then use that to create our objectives for recovery. So if we know that we have got 10 hours, for example, before the impact becomes unacceptable, we know that ideally we want to be recovering, for example, in 6 hours, so that we don't have an instance where we get into that 10-hour and then we have the full force of the impact materializing into unacceptable impact. So that's the reason for a business impact analysis being there. And ultimately, you can't create a BCP if you don't understand what it is that you need to have your BCP focused towards. So that's something to really bear in mind. Now, once you know what your inputs to your BCP are, you understand the risk protocols, you understand all of the dependencies and the interested parties, you can then start to pull together what your business continuity plan will look like. Now, these are some of the things to be thinking about when you're pulling that plan together. First one is around invocation criteria. At what point do you need to invoke that BCP? At what needs to happen for you to say, or for a decision to be made, that you've gone from what is an issue to now a disruptive event that needs a business continuity response? So we need to have invocation criteria. Now that could be, for example, when I talked about the engineer, the engineer example that I've used a few times, it could be that 50% of our fleet is inoperable, and as a result of that, we only have 50% of our engineers able to deliver the service. That could be one of the invocation criteria. Some organizations might say 75%, some might say 25%, but that could be the thing that makes it a business continuity event. It could be that the planning tool where we get the jobs come through to tell us what engineers need to go to which sites. If that goes down and it's down and it's going to be down for at least an hour, that could be an invocation criteria. Either way, we need to be considering what are the things that can happen, what criteria needs to be met for us to invoke the business continuity plan and ultimately stand up that response team. You also need to have in your BCP the roles and responsibilities. Who is going to lead the response is very key. When you enter that crisis scenario, and I don't know how many people have actually entered the crisis scenario where you've had BCP invoked before, you don't have time to be agreeing things. You need to be very much in the space where you have everything that can be predefined and pre-planned is done, so that you know this is what's going to happen, and you get straight into the recovery. So whoever leads the response, being that person, having that person predefined is key to then going straight into a smooth recovery. That person that leads the response is typically the person who would invoke the BCP as well. There has to be an authority for someone to invoke that business continuity plan. What you don't want to have as an example is an event where a BCP is invoked, the criteria wasn't actually met for the BCP to be invoked, and there's no reason for why it was done in the first place. So having a named person that is responsible for invoking and leading the response is key in the BCP itself. And that person usually has to be appointed by top management, and should be, in my opinion, appointed by top management. We also need to understand in the roles and responsibilities who's actually managing the communications, the safety, operations, IT, who's going to be recovering all of those individual aspects, who's going to be managing them, being the interface and the conduit to all of those key areas. And whether they have a direct reporting line to the response lead is irrelevant. In the event of this crisis scenario, they have a duty to be following the lead of the response lead. I've mentioned about objectives already, but this is a key thing to include in your continuity plan. What are the objectives for recovery, and what are those associated timeframes? So if you have a critical service that is noted in your business continuity plan, this is what we need to be, this is our critical service, this is what we need to recover, we would put objectives for that. So what is the minimum business continuity objective for recovery of that item? And it could be that, where I said before, if 50% of the workforce is not at work. That could be the invocation criteria. It could be then our minimum business continuity objective for recovery is that we need to take that from 50 to 60%. So that's the first step. And it could be that we need to achieve that within 3 hours. So we set our objectives and it's clearly listed on there. So we know this is what we're working towards to get us out of the business continuity disruptive event. Now, in addition to the roles and responsibilities, we need to actually say who needs to do what. This isn't always going to be prescriptive. There needs to be a degree of agility in there for people to be able to make decisions that are relevant to the disruptive event as it has emerged. So in this instance, we were setting guidelines for what those roles and responsibilities need to be. So who should do what? High level. We're not talking about prescriptive information here, unless it's a case that you can include that. But often these types of events are quite volatile and ever changing. Communication protocols. So who needs to be told what, when, and how do we tell them? Especially noting that if your principal means of communication is email, you have to be considering what happens if email is unavailable. And if your principal communication medium is email and SMS, what happens if both of those are out? We also need to consider if you use an intranet as another means of your news of disseminating information, but your IT infrastructure is offline and you don't have email, you don't have an intranet. How do you inform people? So these are the types of things to consider when you're not in a crisis scenario, and to be putting that into your plan so that you have a clear route to follow in the event that those particular items are not available to use. And then we also need to think about stand down protocols. So when we've actually achieved the recovery objectives, how do we then stand it down? There needs to be a formal process for stepping out of the disruptive incident and into a recovery operation period. Now, those are the formal things that I would suggest are included in a business continuity plan. But there are a multitude of unwritten things that I've picked up through my years of experience in working in disruptive incidents, working in forming business continuity frameworks and plans. And these are the things that you don't pick up in a standard. The first thing, simplicity. When you're in a high pressure crisis scenario, it needs to be simple. You need to have easy to understand instructions. If there's any ambiguity in there, it just creates confusion. You need calm as well. Crisis scenarios, they are fast-paced, they're volatile, they're challenging. People do panic. If people don't hear something within the first half an hour, for example, in fact, sometimes within the first 10 minutes of not being able to turn their computer on, they'll panic. They'll phone the first person on their contact list, who will then phone another person. And then from there, we start to generate panic. What we need is a response that is calm, fast-paced, and addresses the immediate volatility that's there. Decisiveness. Those scenarios do change rapidly. Decisions are needed, and they're needed quickly. What we can't do is being in a situation where we allow decisions that need to be made to fester and the scenario to get worse. Not every decision that's made is going to be the right one, but sometimes you need to understand when it is necessary to make a decision, and make that decision and stand by that, and then in order to emerge out of the disruptive incident. Agility. What you've written in your BCP, sometimes not everything's going to go according to that. So you could have written a BCP very comprehensive that will address what happens in the event that you have half of your fleet out of action. But actually, what you've written in there might not actually be relevant to what the disruptive incident actually was. It could be that as a result of that, you need to think of what it is that you need to do differently. That doesn't mean that your BCP is useless. It means that you have got an emerging situation. You still have a basis of which to use the BCP to help inform decisions, but you need to be agile. The thing with that as well is that sometimes what is written in a BCP not being relevant, you have to be able to look at what's written, know that sometimes that was written in a non-crisis scenario, and assess whether that is still the relevant thing in this crisis scenario. It's almost that if it says do X, but X is not the right thing based on what's evolved in that scenario, sometimes knowing that X isn't the right thing is the right thing to do. And communication is absolutely critical. If people don't know what's going on, they will panic. And if people panic, then the situation potentially has an opportunity to get worse. So people need to be informed and engaged. As soon as you know what's going on, as soon as you're aware that a disruptive incident has taken place, my suggestion is to get your internal comms team very much mobilized to start communicating out information, even if it's to say, we are aware that there's been a disruptive incident. By you actually acknowledging that something has happened, gives people comfort in knowing that it's not just them. So addressing communication straight away produces the calm and supports with the simplicity. So those are the types of things to consider in a typical business continuity plan. Now I'm going to run through a brief example now. I think I'm doing okay for time. I'm going to look at Tony, Graham, Leslie, to give me a nod if I'm good for time at the moment.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So I'll run in through a quick example of all of the things that I've just spoken about. So an organization, FM Direct, a made-up organization, provide mobile engineering services to clients across the UK. The core service of FM Direct is to receive works requests, which, as I mentioned before, could be to address a heating failure or a power failure at a client site. So receipt of work orders, work requests from clients for FM Direct to then send a suitably competent and local engineer to that client's premises to fulfill that work request, which could be to fix the power outage, to repair the heating. And in this instance, CAFM, CAFM, is the IT application that FM Direct use to receive those works requests and then allocate them to the engineers. Now we have in FM Direct, we've done a BIA, a business impact analysis, and we've identified that this app is critical to us, to our business operations. It must be online within 2 days of having a disruptive event, and that CAFM Supply Limited are the organization external to FM Direct that provide and own the application. So we've written a BCP which will enable us to continue mobile engineering services in the event that CAFM, which is our main IT application, is offline. And we also have an example of Jane as one of our mobile engineers for FM Direct, and Jane receives work directly to her PDA via that CAFM system. That's the context of the organization. Now, the event here is that CAFM Supply Limited, who is the supplier, have had a critical failure, and FM Direct, as a result, are not able to use that system. So if we can't use that system, we cannot receive work requests from our clients to then send to engineers to then go and fulfill our core service, which is to resolve issues at client premises. So if clients are unable to log works requests, Jane can't receive the work, and then operation stops. So based on that, in our BCP, we've set our invocation criteria, and the invocation criteria in this instance has been met. So we've activated the BCP and we've mobilized the response team. Our response to that is invoking the BCP. Clients are then, as part of that BCP, clients are informed to contact FM Direct via SMS as part of our plan of how we work around not having a system. So clients are told to contact us via SMS, and FM Direct have mobilized a team that will then manually manage those works requests. Jane then is still able to receive work requests via SMS and can still deliver mobile engineering services. It's manual, it's not necessarily particularly efficient, but it enables us to continue our critical operation because we've developed a workaround in the event that our core critical operation is affected. So we know that system was absolutely essential for us to deliver our core service. So in the non-crisis scenario, we have developed a plan for what we will do in the event that system is affected. So we're still able to continue our operation. And then within the time frame, CAFM Supply Limited have resolved their failure. The normal service for the system has resumed. And as a result of that, we can come out of the disruptive event and we can stand down the BCP. So based on all of the things that I've spoken about, how the life cycle works, what the BIA, the BCP, etc., that's a really high-level example of the sequence of events that can take place and why it's important that the BIA, the BCP are formed at the point that they're formed, along with the invocation criteria. So hopefully that brings it to life a little bit for you. Also, I forgot to mention the normal operation resumes, and at that point, once we've stood down the BCP, inevitably there will be backlogs. We need to address those as part of the follow-up to the to when we've come out of the disruptive incident. And we then conduct our post-incident review, which I mentioned earlier, and that's where we learn what did and didn't go well in our response. So a really quick overview of the role of a HSEQ professional in business continuity. You've probably seen quite a lot of parallels already, but just to bring some of those to life, risk assessment. So as a HSEQ or health and safety professional, we have very thorough comprehension of risk management principles. So we have an absolute value to add in the assessment of risk, in how effective mitigations are against those risks, and assessing the effectiveness of those controls against those risks. We also understand how management systems work, and as a result, business continuity management systems can and should absolutely be integrated in our wider organization's management system. We also understand incident management, especially when we're in an event when we have to do an instant investigation, whatever context that might be. But with that, we have our experience of navigating volatile events, and we also have experience of doing investigations after an incident. And conscience, a really key part to this, which is absolutely prominent whenever I've been involved in a business continuity event. When there is a crisis, the focus is often what do we do to continue our business operation? But HSEQ often bring to the table the people's voice. How are the people feeling? There is a crisis right now. We need to be understanding that our people are in the midst of that. What are we doing enough to keep them supported and their well-being supported, their safety supported, in fact, as well? So we have a very key role really key role to play in all of this, from the beginning of the management system formulation all the way through to managing it as a day-to-day operation. So some summaries, some takeaways in the summary. I think I've said this multiple times already. In fact, I know I have. Business continuity planning needs to focus on the critical operations of the organization. The robust risk management is essential for us to prevent disruptive events. Not all of them, but some of them. Remember, business continuity is the last line of defense to a disruptive incident. Ideally, we never want to get to that. We want to have robust risk management protocols in place to stop it from ever materializing. The effectiveness of a BCP is in the planning when not in a crisis scenario. We need to think about as much of the possible variables that can emerge when we're not in a crisis scenario as possible, and include that in our BCP. And a BCP without a BIA is a jigsaw without a picture, which is when you're in a high pressure and volatile scenario. So if you imagine you've got this jigsaw to put together, 500-piece jigsaw, it's just been thrown at you, you don't have a picture, and you've got a high pressure scenario that is very volatile. Without that BIA pulling together that BCP, then you have a very challenging scenario. You can't factor everything into a BCP. And you have to be, during the disruptive event, you have to appreciate that there is a need to be agile, decisive, and keeping calm. Testing of a BCP. So arguably this is almost synonymous with audit, but shouldn't necessarily be an audit. We need to test our BCP for us to have confidence that it's actually fit for purpose. We don't want it to be tested during a live event. We want to test it in a scenario, in a safe, controlled environment scenario. And finally, keep it simple. The simpler it is, the easier it is to follow, and the less ambiguity you have in that high pressure scenario. So hopefully that has given you a high level snapshot of the types of things to be considering. Let me just unshare my screen. Types of things to be considering when you are formulating a business continuity plan, business continuity management system, types of things to consider with some real life examples of things that could emerge throughout that whole process. And I will pause there. I'm going to take a drink, and if there's any questions, I will do my absolute best to answer.
Yeah, there are some questions in the chat box, Chris. So there is one from Anthony Hogan. Anthony, are you there, and would you like to just discuss your question? and you're still on mute, just
In
in
fact, I've
case
just
you
seen it
are.
in the chat. Are there any other scenarios that should be considered? Civil unrest, key people not being able to work remotely? Absolutely. So those 6 that I initially put on there are just really are just 6. There are so many other potential scenarios that could emerge. So civil unrest is absolutely a key thing. Single point of failures, potentially. It really depends on how imperative and how critical that, if there is a single point of failure and how relevant it is to your critical operation and critical service. So if it's a case that your entire critical process is reliant on one person, then you might want to think about having a continuity plan for how you would continue in the event that that single point of failure emerges. So yes, and then I think you put civil unrest, key people. So civil unrest absolutely is a key thing. If we think about the recent landscape within the UK, that's absolutely been a very real thing. For some organisations, there has been a need to invoke business continuity planning. For other organisations, not necessarily. It really depends on your key, on what you've identified in your as your key services. But yes, absolutely, there are other scenarios. In my career, I've written scenarios as well for fatality. So what happens in the event of a fatality? That very much could enter a business continuity scenario. I mentioned before about severe weather, inaccessibility to key locations. And it might sound silly, but things like war as well very much could happen, very much could affect business continuity as well. So lots of potential scenarios, but you have to consider those based on your risk management protocol. So whatever you've identified as a risk to your organization and to your critical services. So yes, absolutely. Just looking at other comments in here. BCP for Dunelm and recent CrowdStrike event. The recent CrowdStrike event was a very pertinent example, because that example wasn't specific to one organization. It affected organizations globally, and so it was almost like we're all in this together, experiencing the same issue, but with different degrees of impact, and that brought a real emphasis to the need for business continuity. So some organizations dealt with it exceptionally well, others were crippled by it. But yeah, absolutely, it was a challenging event. It just so happened to happen on a Friday morning as well and go all the way into the weekend. And so for organizations that don't have necessarily weekend operating personnel, that was a challenging scenario. Simulations, do you run simulations for companies? So in the organization I'm in, we tend to, as part of our exercising and testing, we will do simulations, more basic simulations that we've kind of put together. But when we need to do a very specific or very what's the word? Detailed scenario, we tend to bring in an external organization for that. We tell them the scope and set out the parameters. And then from there, it's almost give us an absolute, don't just be absolutely ruthless with us. We need to know how effective we're actually going to deal with this. And then from there, we do have a very ruthless scenario. And at the end of that, we get a very good report that tells us what we didn't do well. And sometimes the really basic things are called out as not having been done. Those basic things, for example, could be that, and in fact, this happened at a previous organization. It took about half an hour before anyone picked up or looked to find the BCP. So we were in this crisis scenario. We have this external organization that's coming to support us facilitating this simulation. And they've just told us that X has happened, and as a result, this critical operation is out of action. So people were in the room talking about what they do, but no one picked up the BCP. So it just shows that when you're in a panic, you don't tend to think about the most logical thing to do, and that brought a lot to the forefront of that awareness and training is also a necessity in your business continuity protocols, not just the documentation and the management system. I can't remember who it is that we use, but I'll take that away and I'll speak to and I'll have a look, because we use different providers based on different scenarios. So specifically, for example, The most recent one we've used is for a cyber scenario because that was deemed as one of our a risk that was most prominent for us. So we've done a simulation specifically on cyber. But I'll take that away and come back.
Yeah, there's also a question from Gillian Wood. Gillian, would you like to come on and ask your question?
I'm just reading through it now as well. Yeah, so the comms and the PR part are critical. So I mentioned as well in the BCP you have the roles and responsibilities, and then you have someone managing the comms. That has to be internal and external comms. When I said about brand, that is a critical part to business continuity that is often overlooked, certainly in my experience. We're so focused sometimes on just recovering our core process and our core services that we don't think about what the perception of the organization is from external stakeholders and also from clients as well. So if we're just focused purely on recovering our services, but we haven't issued any statements to external statements, any statements to our clients or to our suppliers, it does start to affect your brand. It starts to affect confidence in your brand as well. And whether you choose to have a statement that's made proactively or reactively, either way, you need to have them in your arsenal ready to go. So as soon as you know that an incident has happened, and your invocation criteria are met, and you've invoked your BCP, at that point, comms, whoever owns comms, should be evaluating everything that is known about that disruptive event and deciding whether communications to internal and external stakeholders need to be made and the manner and the format of those communications. So you need to be very selective as well as who you include in your response team. They need to be competent, probably quite senior as well, to be able to have the authority and the autonomy to make the relevant decision for the action that needs to be taken. So hopefully that gives some context on that one. Next one was around emergency response arrangements, accepted bronze, silver, and gold commander structure, carry over to the early phases of BCP risk evaluation. So let me read that. So have you found that emergency response arrangements that have accepted bronze, silver, and gold commander structure carry over to the early phases of BCP risk evaluation? Sorry, it might just be the way I'm reading it, but I'm not sure I understand the question.
So I don't know if you can hear me, Martin Holland.
Yes. Hi, Martin.
It's generally people have bronze, silver, and gold responses to emergency preparedness, as in, how do we deal with an incident? And quite often you get the seniors who have the positions to make the decisions. Once they've gone through that process, I've found that they then become much more aware of the business continuity, the longer effect, and are in a position. And I've been able to find those people become good ambassadors for actually thinking about the longer term of business continuity. Have you found similar sort of things, or are there other ways that you've managed to get the seniors in position to take business continuity just as much a focus as incident response?
Yeah, a good point. Absolutely. And I think the more involved they are to see the reality of the incident, the more engagement that you would get with that. Absolutely. So we have whenever I've built BCPs and emergency response plans, whatever they would look like, I've always had the response lead has to be a board member. In my just in the ones that I built, it's a board member, and that board member isn't just the owner of the response, but they're the sponsor for business continuity. So if it's a board member and they know that they are the response lead in the event that scenario emerges, it's in their interests to make sure that the right preparation is done and the right infrastructure is in place to deal with that disruptive incident. So conversations happen in the background as a result of that. When they're in the board and business continuity is a subject, then they are more engaged with it because they understand their role in that and they have a degree of accountability with it to make sure that it is effective and it's in place. So yes, absolutely. I do think they need to be part of it, but I also think as well, beyond them being part of the response, the buy-in has to be there throughout the whole process. Trying to implement, deploy, develop a business continuity infrastructure in an organization that doesn't have an appetite for it is one of the most challenging experiences that I've ever had. I've likened it to, it's like an ant trying to push a tricycle. And if that tricycle is just got that one ant trying to push it, you're not going to, it's just not going to move. And then you have a crisis scenario, and then you'll just have people shouting and jumping up and down about what's going on and how are we moving this forward. But actually, the organisation has a part to play in that if they've not had the appetite and the support there. So the engagement is critical, and simulations help to get that engagement, because then they see how ready they actually are to deal with a crisis event. So hopefully that helps with some context around it.
Thank you. Yep.
So just reading through the next questions. Not make it is also. Oh, sorry, I've just seen Leslie's comment there. Yeah, I don't think there's any other questions on there that I can see. But what I would say is that if there are any other questions that anyone has specifically for me, more than happy to take them. Just I think I'm pretty sure there's a channel in to be able to record any questions, and then they can get sent to me, and I can do my best to answer them as well. But I think I also saw early on about the slides, so I'm happy for the slides to be shared. I'll just take out that first slide about me. You don't want a picture of me from 7-8 years ago when I was 3 stone lighter and less wrinkles and more hair and less grey and all that stuff. So I'll take that slide out for you. Also, a feature that I didn't realize was on Zoom, but I've smoothed off all my edges. You can there's a slider to smooth your facial features. So I'll put that right at the max. So I actually got quite a lot more wrinkles in this, but great to see that Zoom has some qualities. Never used Zoom before. So yeah.
Okay, Chris, Leslie, yeah.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, I take it there's no more questions. On that note, could you just put, if you want a copy of the slides, your email address in the chat button, and we'll get them sent to you. As I said before, we don't.
Tony, sorry to jump in, but obviously I can pick up the emails from the registration, so I'm happy to share those slides once Chris shares them. So they don't need to drop their email address in the chat. I can pick it up.
Okay, so you share them with everyone then, Chris?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Any more questions then? No. Oh, well, on that note, Chris, I'd just like to say thank you for your presentation. The feedback we're getting is excellent. It's clearly very knowledgeable and very, very passionate about the subject. And it's something that we all need to consider doing, whether we're legally required or not, because isn't the civil contingencies just for local authorities? Chris, am I right in saying that? So
last bit again, sorry, Tony.
Isn't the Civil Contingency Act just for local authorities and that business continuity plan? So although there's no legal duty for many businesses, there is that moral duty, there is that good continuity, business continuity reason for doing this, isn't it?
And there's also, yes, and there's also, I have never seen, and I'm from the, I don't work in public sector, but I know that it does exist in the public sector as well. I've never seen a contract that doesn't have a specific contractual requirement to have an effective, established, and tested BCP, and that is, it's every bid has it, every contract I've ever seen has it. So it is a contractual obligation as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for your presentation. It's very, very thorough and excellent, and it's one we've never had before. It's been very well received, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.